All right. Thank you for sticking with us for our final installment of Margin of Error. I'm Dave Wasserman, the House editor for the Cook Political Report. And 2 years ago, I got to hang out as a fellow at the IOP. And I'm really glad I got that experience in under the wire, because it's probably the only or one of a handful of places in the country where you can get 20 kids to voluntarily show up for 2 hours on a Monday to talk about gerrymandering and redistricting standards for zero course credit. So I really look forward to being back when it's safe. And I like to think that we've saved some of our best panelists for last. Each of these four nerds could have done a terrific job on any of the previous panels, but I've selfishly claimed them for my own panel. So for the next hour, we're going to talk about methodology and building a better data-informed public. And so let me introduce our panel briefly, and then we'll dive right in. Cornell Belcher is the president of Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies and a current political contributor for MSNBC, where we've had some spirited discussions in the previous months that I've really enjoyed. Previously, Belcher served as pollster to the DNC, making him the first minority to hold such a role in either party. He also worked on the polling for both Obama presidential campaigns. Nate Cohn covers elections, polling, and demographics for The Upshot at the New York Times. I first got to know Nate back when he was working for the New Republic, and in a short amount of time, I think he's really risen to the top of this field, whether it's the Needle, the live polling project in 2018, or his deep dives in polling analysis. Frankly, I think the work that The Upshot did this past cycle in particular blew away a lot of the competition. Ashley Kirzinger is the Associate Director for Public Opinion and Survey Research Team at the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a leader in health policy analysis and journalism. We at Cook have been very fortunate to work with Ashley and Kaiser on several polling projects in the past few years. And I'm also very excited to learn that Ashley is the incoming standards chair for APOR, the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And then last but not least, David Shor is a data scientist for OpenLabs, a progressive nonprofit research lab. Previously, Shor was the director of political data science at Civis Analytics, whose clients included the Obama campaign. And I asked him here because I've been stalking his PowerPoints over the course of the last few years. And he was talking about a lot of the non-response bias issues that we've been discussing over the past day or so, well before the 2020 election, well before November, frankly. So first question, I want to throw this out as an open-ended one. What did you learn about polling in 2020? And I wanted to give each of you 3 minutes or 3 or 4 minutes. And Nate, I want to start with you, because a week after the election on November 10th, you wrote, asking for a polling post-mortem at this stage is a little bit like asking a coroner for the cause of death while the body is still at the crime scene. And you're going to have to wait to conduct a full autopsy. So with the benefit of a couple months and perhaps a few voter files, I'm not sure how deeply we've had the chance to dive into them yet, what do we know now?
Well, to start at where you left off, we do have voter files trickling in from most of the battleground states at this point. The data that I've seen suggests that turnout probably was some factor in the polling error. If I had to make a guesstimate, I would say that the Times Siena polls were off by maybe on average 1 percentage point on the partisan makeup of the electorate, based on the party registration of voters and actual voter files versus what our final polling showed. But I think that would fall more into the category as being one of many contributors to the polling error, as opposed to a central cause of the polling error. The same finding holds up at the individual level when we look at which of our respondents participated in the election, which ones didn't. I don't know whether that will be a generalizable finding. Maybe Monmouth's going to come back and say, actually, our turnout model was way worse than the Times Siena turnout model, and that was the whole problem. But at least in our case, I would not attribute the cause of death to high turnout. To link that back to your initial question, then, what did we learn about polling this year? I might argue that maybe we didn't learn so much about polling yet. And if I may frame that as something that we've learned to make it more directly responsive, maybe we've learned that the polling community has fallen behind. It's not keeping up with the challenges that it faces. You just pointed out, for instance, that David Shor is telling you about all sorts of the issues that public opinion that we've been talking about at this conference over the last few days, like social trust or the right kinds of white working class voters and so on. You're right about that. David Shor's been talking about that for a long time, and he's not the only person who's been talking about that for a long time. And after 6 years of these issues coming up, really since the 2014 midterm election, I would ask whether the polling community has really crossed anything off of its list. Has it identified a problem, researched it to its satisfaction, disseminated findings, and then had it be implemented by practitioners? And I think that on issue after issue, the answer is that no, the polling community has not gone from a hypothesis about a problem to a solution. So, you know, we get an election like 2020 where the polls are wrong and everyone has an immediate hypothesis like it's social trust. And that's not a new problem. And if the polling community was keeping up with its problems, maybe that wouldn't have been what went wrong in this particular election.
All right, I think that's a great jumping off point for our discussion later. But Cornell, what did you learn about polling in 2020?
I've learned that you all pay too much attention to polling, and you're looking and you're using polling to drive a narrative that you should not be using polling to do. And as someone who actually, you know, does both his daytime job and sort of working campaigns and his side hustle being talking about it on television, is too much of our narrative is being driven by polling, and we are using polling in a way that it should not be used. And I'm not here to bury polling like some others. I'm here to, quite frankly, praise polling. I think you know, the whole ideal that if we don't nail a horse race, there's something wrong with polling. Polling shouldn't be used to nail a horse race, and far too often we're using the horse race as a driving story in the media. And I would say that from a media standpoint, we got to think about how we are using polling to drive a narrative, because there's too many X factors, and then if a poll doesn't exactly nail a horse race at the end, then there's something wrong with the polling. Well, you know what? Polling's job isn't in fact to nail a horse race exactly at the end, right? On the campaign, every day, we're in fact using the polling information to move the horse race and to influence the sort of turnout. So there's so many X factors. So what I've learned is frankly that we should and the media should pull back and rethink about how we're using polling to drive a narrative about what's going to happen, and that can be misleading because I think we're using polling in the wrong way.
I can already tell we're going to have a great hour of discussion. All right, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dave, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So the lesson I learned in 2020 is polling has to innovate. I think we came out of the 2016 election and there was a great postmortem done by APOR and said, you know, pointed out to missing populations and lack of state polling. And so the polling community really, you know, rallied around this. And, you know, us at KFF, we really wanted to embrace those lessons from the 2016 election. And so we wanted to make sure that our polling relied on multi-modes to contact individuals to make sure that we're getting the most representative sample, weighting to the known population parameters out there, including education, and that we just didn't focus on the national picture. You know, Dave mentioned that KFF partnered with the Cook Political Report the past couple of years to do some polls. And this was really different for KFF because we're not horse race pollsters, right? We are hardcore issue pollsters. And when we're looking at elections, we're really looking at the issues that are driving voters and really what's motivating them to either turn out or stay home on election day. And so in 2020, we did a series of state polls, both in the upper Midwest, that blue wall region that was so critical in 2016, and then also in the Sun Belt. Earlier or back in 2020, we did the Sun Belt, so Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina as well. And we learned a lot from our polling that I'm happy to talk about. But, you know, the project was definitely a gamble for us because it was using a different methodology than we had ever used previously. And so and a lot of the previous panels have talked about this, you know, multi-mode projects are really what I think is the future for polling. What we did is, you know, we started with mail contacts, pushing people to complete a survey online. And then we did phone follow-ups for those voters who we had matched telephone numbers who hadn't completed the project yet. So a long way to get to your question, but the lesson that I learned is that the common story that people don't want to participate in polling or that polling is dead, it really isn't true. We just have to meet people where they are. The states that we did, they were very successful, both in terms of response rates, as well as the demographics of our sample, getting voters to participate in the survey. So we learned that people want to participate. We just had to let them respond or participate using the mode that they prefer, whether that's online for certain populations or whether it's over the phone for other populations that aren't going to go online and take a survey. And so by doing these multi-modes and being innovative, I think this is the future of good polling. And by good, I think everyone understands, I mean representative polling. So that's the lesson for me out of 2020 is that we need to continue to innovate.
All right, David.
Yeah, what I would say is this was a very bad year for polling. The overall in 2016, you could say that there wasn't much of a national miss, but this year, we saw a 3% bias on our Senate races and a 2 to 2.5 bias on the presidency. The state error pattern was just as large as it was and actually identical to what it was in 2016. And more importantly than that, really fundamental questions about the nature of the electorate were really totally miscalled. Basically, every set of public polls out there projected that education polarization was going to substantially decrease when it actually substantially increased, really almost as much as it did in 2016. There were very large there was a very large decline with Hispanic voters that really was not captured by public polls. In Florida, we probably lost something like 13 to 14% in support among Hispanics, and that's percentage points, not margin. We're talking about double-digit margin misses that are very substantively important, and also just for understanding the nature of the electorate, and also very important for making campaign decisions. And I really believe the causes of this are really deep and fundamental and aren't really something that can be fixed with the kind of changes that people like to talk about. We'll wait on one more thing, or we'll do multi-mode surveys or whatever. I think the only real solution to surveys, now that response rates are a lot lower and now that the sheer act of answering a survey is much more partisan and much more political than it used to be, really involves really pretty sophisticated methods and technology, the collection of extensive first-party data, voter files, appends, trying to figure out how to get all kinds of first-party data that isn't just in voter files, and then doing pretty sophisticated machine learning, not just building support models or simple supervised learning, but actually doing deeper things, taking into account that we have different information on different people. And I don't think that the old model of polling and of pollsters, where you have a polling shop and you have you have one or two poli-sci grad students, and then you call a bunch of people and you do some stuff, I don't really think that works anymore. I think that the industry is really going to have to move away from polls as a unit of analysis, more toward much more sophisticated modeling and the collection of data. And as a result, things are going to be a lot less transparent. I mean, it's the douchey thing to say. I frankly kind of believed this before the election, but I do think that this really proves it. There wasn't really any pollster that got this right. A lot of people tried a bunch of different things. And, the actual culprit for why we were wrong this time, that Democrats started answering their phones a lot after coronavirus, is not something that any of the proposed easy fixes, whether it's like MRP or whether it's weighting by education or social trust, would have fixed. And so I think that that's a real, it's a real crisis. And I think people, even after 2020, have really understated the extent to which that's true.
Well, thank you. And if there's one takeaway that I've gotten from the conference so far and from you guys, is that, look, there may be no one silver bullet here. There may be no one fix that we can make, like a lot of people thought weighting by education was a fix after 2016. So I guess, I do want to focus throughout the hour on how do we rethink this more holistically. Nate, I have a series of questions that are directed to each of you. I want Nate and Cornell to jump in on this first, because in the last few years, we've really witnessed the rise of the modeling wars and polling-based models that imply very precise chances of certain outcomes. I think it's safe to say now that no one was justified in saying there was an 83.67% chance of anything happening last November. And even polling-based models that implied less precision, such as ours, when it came to trying to forecast the outcome in the House, missed the mark. And so has modeling become an unhealthy obsession? And how do we do a better job of communicating the data and its limitations? And Nate, why don't you start?
I am very sympathetic to that point of view. And in fact, I have never participated in a pre-election poll-based model, even when the New York Times had one in 2016. If you Control F for my name on the page, I'm not there. When I have a number of reservations about that approach, at least at the level in which it would be adopted by an organization like the New York Times. I'm not sure that means that any probabilistic model has to be banished from the internet. And if you publish something like 538 does, that we should all yell at them or something. But I do think there are serious critiques of it. I think the most fundamental critique is that we have very little insight into into what we think the true probabilities are based on a limited empirical sample of previous elections with polling. We don't really have a great sense of the range of possibilities in terms of poll error. We can look at what the average poll error has been in recent elections, but we don't know whether that will be true going forward. If you want to dig into my Twitter account from the summer, you'll find me arguing with Ryan Enos of Harvard, along with G. Elliott Morris and some other people about whether it's even fair to refer to these forecasts as being forecasts. They are not simulating the future in the way that a weather model might say a cold front's going to move through. It straps some uncertainty around a measurement, and I think that's a fundamentally different enterprise in terms of explaining uncertainty to people. Because if we're going to have these measurements, we probably do need some way to communicate that those measurements may be imperfect. I think that the Upshot has done a lot over the last few years to think about this. Not all of it successfully, in my view. Live polling, as you mentioned, was one attempt at that. It was sort of this idea that maybe if we showed people how the sausage was made, then maybe they would see that it was sausage and not filet mignon or something like that. There was, we did an experiment where we shared micro data with other pollsters, and we arrived at different results for a pre-election survey of Florida. I thought that did a good job of showing the extent that surveys, the methodological choices by pollsters have an effect on the top line number, and that those choices are debatable and potentially all defensible. In 2020, we did a poll average that showed the hypothetical result if the polls were off as much as they were in 2016, which I think is, offered a concrete vision of what a poll miss would look like that was grounded in some sort of reality for people, as opposed to an abstract idea that there was a 17% chance that the other side would win. And all of these things are fundamentally limited. None of them provide a full account of the scope of all of the poll error that's possible. I mean, just to link together a few of those concepts, if you take a total survey error approach, our efforts to show, the margin of error or something include one part of it. Showing methodological choices is another part of it. The amount things can change between now and election is another component. And hypothetically, if all of these different sources of error were to align in an election, the total error on a survey could greatly exceed what we show in any one of these different indicators. So I think it's a real challenge. But I think that the central priority would be the pollsters start by being honest with themselves, the polling community being honest with itself about the scale of the problem, because you're not going to persuade the public of a limitation that you can't acknowledge yourself. And in this conference so far, I've heard a lot of people suggest that SSRS poll showing double-digit leads for Biden, or ABC Washington Post poll showing Biden plus 17 in Wisconsin, whatever, or the Fabrizio polls, or whatever, that if they're off by a significant amount, that's likely due to the margin of error. That's a product of random sampling. It's just a 1 in 20 miss. If that's your defense of what's happening here, I don't think you're being honest about the scale of the problem. If you're not able to grapple with that fundamental fact, I don't see how you can expect readers to have the right takeaway themselves.
Cornell, I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
there's no silver bullet, and I think Ashley's spot on. I mean, you got to come at this from multiple different ways. And as a practitioner, I mean, the challenge is especially so if you're a challenger, the challenge is if you're working on a Senate or a House race and you've got to make $1 million buy this week, how many different ways can you come at it? Because you got to be timely, and we're making really sort of quick decisions about how you spend a lot of money to move voters. But I'm going to go back to where I started, and is this idea of got it wrong. Look, if you are if you're one of the brilliant pollsters on the Biden campaign, did you get it wrong? No, you didn't get it wrong. Your guy won. As a pollster on a campaign, and it's funny because I was just actually talking to a client of mine who is going up for re-elect here in this off year in one of the large metropolitan areas, and I reminded her that several years ago, when she first ran for mayor, I told her the least important number in the poll, particularly early on, is a horse race. The least important number in a poll is a horse race. What's important in that poll is the attitudinal stuff and understanding not where voters are going to be, because because again, polling wasn't created to actually tell us where the electorate's going to be. And I know we want it to, but that was never the job of polling, to say this is absolutely where the electorate's going to be. I think that's misusing polling. As a practitioner, what I'm using polling to do is figure out how to move the electorate along and figure out sort of why people are there where they are right now, and how in which we might be able sort of to move them one place or the other. So
can I ask though about just the modeling wars, and David and Ashley, feel free to jump in. Cornell, earlier you were very critical of how the media interprets the polling that you and others do. Do you think that?
Well, I was getting to that.
Okay.
I was getting that. And look, and my point was, I don't think there's one perfect way to go about it, which is what Ashley's initial point was, and I second that. It's not one perfect way to go about it. I mean, look, if you had my friend Joel on this conference call, he'd have some really interesting things to say about modeling. Sort of modeling from 2016 and that campaign. I don't think there's not a silver bullet. Right? There's no one great way to do it. And the other thing is common sense, right? Polling is both an art and a science, and if you don't get the art right, the science doesn't matter. And look, I said, hell, you might be on the show where I said this on MSNBC. We don't know exactly, the polling is going to be off because we don't know what the electorate's going to be. Frankly, this electorate, we got an electorate that looks like nothing we've seen in recent history. So that's the X factor, right? There's the art of polling and there's the science of polling. The art of polling, and if you don't get the art of it right, and sort of who's going to be turning out, you're never going to sort of nail the horse race accurately. But again, my point is, as a practitioner, I'm not worried about getting that horse rate 100% right. I'm worried about sort of, am I moving voters toward my candidate? Am I moving voters away from my opponent? And can I measure that? I think for campaigns, I think that's really important. Like the idea that Biden was going to win by 17 or 15 points any battleground state, well, that's just ridiculous on the face of it. I mean, it just is. And my last point about the narrative, that we got to be careful about the narrative, what we're driving here is, a couple of weeks out from the election, there was a Florida poll, and it had, I think it had Biden at 47, Trump at 45. And the headline was Biden's leading Florida. And then understandably, our readers are, oh, well, Biden's going to win Florida. And that becomes the narrative. And when I say we got to be more careful about sort of the narrative that we drive with data, well, that's a false narrative because that doesn't mean at all that Biden's going to eventually win Florida, because you've got a lot of people sitting on the fence, and you've got a lot of shifting that's going to happen back and forth. So when I say we spend too much time focusing on a horse race, driving the narrative, that's what I mean, and it's misleading.
All right, I want to give David and Ashley a chance to jump in if they want to.
I definitely have takes. Happy to go after Ashley.
Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think that election forecasting is a really easy target. I'm going to say I think it's really good. I think it's really important. People want to know who's going to win the election. And, that's both a public matter of public interest, but it's also something that's actually very important. When Democrats shot up in the polls after Lafayette Park, Republicans and Donald Trump really did change a lot of their messaging decisions and a lot of their policy decisions. Polling in the early fall and late summer really had a very big influence on a lot of the coronavirus negotiations. Politicians use polling and like this overall chance of winning to help calibrate their decisions, because they're constantly making different decisions. They're putting ads up in the air, they're changing their messaging, and they look at how the polling changes in order to get a sense of what's working and what's not. It's the only feedback it's one of the only pieces of feedback you can really get in an election cycle. And I think that if you look at what the pre-election forecasting world looked like, people were really making a bunch of ad hoc decisions on the basis of random polls that they saw. And I think there was a great graph on Twitter, I can't remember who made it, where someone looked at polls in Texas and how many retweets the polls got as a function of the margin. And you could see that the polls that were the most wrong were the most widely shared. And so, this problem of taking all of the available information and condensing it into one number that tracks your chance of winning, that's, from a small d Democratic perspective, actually a very important thing. And in the absence, but actually doing it in the absence of like formal algorithms, people are going to just do it on the basis of what polls they randomly see, and they're going to have a lot of cognitive biases, and that's going to make them make worse decisions. So I actually think this kind of thing is really important. And I think that there's all kinds of reasonable things that you can do to try to show uncertainty and explain these things. But I think the reality is that one of the biggest things people want from our field, one of the only reasons people give us money, why people read us or whatever, is that they want to know who's going to win. And I think it's really important to just do the best job that you can at doing that. And, I think that there have been misses in the past, though, I'm a big fan of Nate Silver, and I think he actually does a very good job at trying to capture uncertainty in various ways. But the solution is to do that problem better, not to pretend that the problem doesn't exist or isn't important. That's my take.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to what everyone else has said. At Cornell, I love, polling is an art and a science. And, we don't do horse race polling. So I never think that's the most important thing in a poll, right? I always think it's the attitudinal, the other components, so you better understand the dynamics. And I think the modeling, as David said, it shows how a race is changing over time, and it shows the dynamics of the election. I don't have any problem with any of that. I think, we're not great about talking about the error associated with our polls as a community. I think some of us do it better than others. Nate does a really good job. I think the live interviewing thing that he did with the upshot was really beneficial to the industry, so that people understand the number of phone calls that have to be made in order to get people to even answer the phone, let alone take a survey. And so I think, we need to do better as a community to talk about the error and the judgments that we're making and how these judgments may lead to different types of error. And so all of that just has to be incorporated. And what the problem that exists is that then the public is just relying on these models and not actually digging into the individual methodological and decisions made by each pollster, which I think, it's part mostly our fault and part the public, just needs more education on this.
All right, Ashley, because you are a big issue pollster and not a horse race pollster, by the way, respect. I want to ask you something topical. You've polled and done extensive research on vaccines, disinformation, and hesitancy. But in 2020, you were writing quite a bit about how you noticed a much higher response rate when polls led with questions on COVID. So what's your level of concern that we're undersampling COVID dismissive people?
Yeah, this is a big concern. I think non-response bias is something that we have dealt with as a polling community for a while. I'm going to tag on to some comments that, Ann Seltzer and Claudia Dean said yesterday, right? So polling has gotten very, very hard, and pollsters, we need to do a better job of paying attention who's not only included in our polls, but excluded. And then, there's no one right way to do a poll, but, these different methodologies have different trade-offs. So, non-response bias when it comes to horse race polling, it leads to candidate X maybe having a larger margin than candidate Y. But, in coronavirus vaccine polling, this non-response bias has, I think, larger and perhaps more important impacts, right? So if we are misestimating the share of the public that is vaccine hesitant, that means that we may not be reaching herd immunity at the stage that we are expecting to, and it means that life in the U.S. is going to be very different for much longer, right? So these are the concerns that we are really worried about. And so how, Dave, you're right. At the beginning of 2020, we saw that if we said that this is a poll about coronavirus, people were more likely to take it. I'm not talking about huge increases in response rates. We're talking like a 6% response rate to like a 12% response rate. Those have largely gone away now, right? So it could have been an impact of people being home and the type of people that are being home and the type of people that had time to talk on the phone to a pollster. It may also be the fact that people, this was a global pandemic like we have never experienced before, and they wanted to share how it's impacting their lives and impacting the lives of their children. And so all of this was, and it just meant that we had less effort to get people to take a survey, and less effort in, my world means less money, right? So we didn't have to call them quite as many times. But that's largely gone away. Instead, now what we're struggling with is that we're having to spend a considerable amount of time and effort to make sure we're getting at the most vaccine hesitant populations. As you can probably imagine, the correlation between non-response to a survey is very high with people who are less likely to want to get a coronavirus vaccine. So we are now doing large oversamples of Black and Hispanic populations. This includes both, we've always been majority cell phone, but now we're 80% cell phone completes. Our surveys, we've been conducting interviews in Spanish for the past decade, so that's not anything new, but it means that we're oversampling pay-as-you-go telephones. So those are those cell phones that are more prominent in lower income and Hispanic communities. We are oversampling both in our cell phone frame and our landline frame of Hispanic and African-American populations. So using rate centers with cell phones and census blocks with the landlines. And so we're just spending tremendous amounts of effort and money to make sure that we're reaching those populations. And we're increasing our sample size. We're up to nearly 500 African Americans and 500 Hispanics in our national poll. So another group that's hard is to reach, and I think, we've talked about this, is Republicans and Trump Republicans in particular. This group is definitely harder because they're just less willing to participate in polls generally. And they think that the impacts of COVID are exaggerated. So it's not like telling them that this is a poll about COVID is going to encourage them to participate, because they are less likely to have changed their behaviors and less likely to think that, or more likely to think that the impacts are exaggerated. One way that we've, tried to address this is oversampling of rural and paying attention to our rural sample. That gets us some of the way there, but definitely not all of the way there. And so I think it's something that we have to, keep in mind. The good thing is that we can, we have national data to kind of look at our poll and see how it looks like, right? So we ask people whether they've gotten vaccinated. And if that number starts looking inflated, you know, as the unweighted or the weighted data compared to what we know is occurring nationally, then we know that there may be a problem with our sample. And so that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on. Right now it looks fine, but you know, if it starts to look like we're getting a larger share of our samples saying that they're getting vaccinated than we know is existing in the public, then that's something that we're going to have to adjust for. I think the key thing for all of this is that it takes efforts and resources and, you know, mostly money, right? This is becoming an incredibly expensive thing to do well. And, you know, and so, but, you know, it has some real world implications that, you know, keep me up at night. So
let me turn this over to David, because David, you've been talking about the relationship between low social trust, polling, COVID, propensity for Trump support for a long time. And Ashley was talking about some of the techniques that she has used to get some of the way there. But in your view, how do we know where there is? And, you know, in your view, how much of the polling error in 2020 was unique to the times we're living in right now? And what methodologically can we do about the rest?
You know, I think that there were kind of two polling errors in 2020. You know, the first was basically the same error that we saw in statewide polls in 2016 and in 2018, where public polls underestimated support in relative terms in more educated areas and overestimated Democratic support in kind of areas with high non-college white, high non-college white populations. But then there was a second error on top of that. And that really was just due to coronavirus making Democrats stay at home and Republicans not stay at home. And, you know, this shows up in a lot of ways in the administrative data. It also shows up in the polling. And so, you know, I think that second piece will presumably maybe go away. Like eventually lockdowns will stop. Eventually Democrats will go about their lives at the same rates as Republicans. But the other piece is still going to be there. And frankly, you know, there'll be a new thing at some other point. You know, every single cycle, differential non-response is really shockingly volatile. There's kind of two different ways that things can happen. Like with social trust, you know, low social trust people have always not answered phones. You know, there's research showing that areas with low social trust have lower census response rates going back to the 70s, but it used to be fairly uncorrelated with partisanship. And then in 2016, it became correlated with partisanship, and suddenly we have an error. And then, you know, in 2020, we have a new non-response bias problem coming up. It wasn't about correlations. It was just about, you know, something changed in the world. And these things are going to keep happening, you know, and that's why polling error keeps persisting. You know, we're always fighting the last election, and I'm not criticizing that. It's the only thing we can do. But then new things will pop up. What I will say is that I really think, to an extent that's underappreciated, the traditional RDD polling model, and really, I think phone polling in general has very deep problems that, you know, are an issue with horse race, but I think, frankly, are actually a much bigger problem with issues, and in some ways with messaging than with the horse race, in that people who answer phone surveys, especially now, are just much, much more politically engaged than the overall population. And this is true even when you control for administrative vote history. If you have two people who have the exact same vote history, they both voted in one of the last two elections or whatever, the person who answers the phone is something like 20 to 30% more likely than the person who doesn't. And that's conditioning on vote history, which is something that that pollsters generally don't even do. And so this means that, you know, most of the research that we see out there is really sampling this highly engaged segment of the population in a way that cannot be controlled for. Definitely not with, with traditional, weighting techniques, but also even if you went the extra step and tried to copy what campaign pollsters are doing and join to the voter file like Cohn has done, there's still a really limited ability to do that. Like I don't think that any of these traditional levers that people talk about are really can get even a part of the way there when it comes to phone surveys. And, you know, that's why personally, you know, I think in my world, we conducted our last phone survey, I think in 2017, just because people on web panels are also super weird in different ways, but at the very least, they're not hyper engaged. You know, we're really at a point now where answering a survey is a political act to an extent that wasn't true 20 years ago. And if you have a highly political act, that is going to be super correlated with partisanship. And so what we see, just, you know, talking about trends, you know, whenever something happens in the news, like, if Democrats have a good news cycle, highly engaged Democrats pick up the phone more, and then this creates lots of differential noise movement or highly exaggerates movement that's there. And I think that that's just really fundamental to any method that is relying on phone surveys. And to be clear, web surveys have a lot of those same problems, but at least in that world, you have panel data, you have re-IDs, and there's a lot of there's stuff you can do. So I don't know. I would just say that even though I do admire everyone, I realize everyone's working very hard, and this is a very hard problem. But I think this is a much harder problem than I think even in the polling industry it is acknowledged.
Yeah, given the chances or the challenges of getting a representative sample these days, Cornell, you worked on several Democratic campaigns in the South in 2020. And in your view, what explains why polls were fairly on target in Georgia, but Democratic expectations were perhaps a bit overheated in South Carolina or elsewhere?
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to point out, Dave's absolutely right. But it's a moving goalpost, right? Dave's right. It's like every cycle, there's something different that we have to solve for. And ultimately, we can't, right? This is what I'm trying to say is ultimately, there's always going to be that big sort of error in there because things are constantly changing. So I don't think there's one way to go at it. I think there was it's about sort of who's going to show up. And look, I think there was a mistake, again, a mistake in the art for a lot of deep posters who looked at 2018 and then did not recognize. And I'm guilty. I thought we would get a Trump surge, but the Trump surge was real. And did we surge a lot of Black and brown voters? Yes. But there was also a lot of those Trump voters who were sort of underneath the radar who showed up on election day. And so that's an X factor that's going to be hard or nearly impossible for a pollster to account for all these different variables, which gets me back to my original point. And David, I'm a message guy, I stay on message. We've got to do a better job of informing our one of the sort of the sort of title this is how to sort of inform the public better about data. But take South Carolina, a race that I worked on, and so we'll have a poll that has, Harrison 45, Graham 44, and then we run with the headline that Jamie Harrison's leading in South Carolina. And what builds off of that? Now, are campaigns using that for fundraising? Absolutely. To show viability? Absolutely they are. But more broadly to the public, are we doing a poor job are we in fact misinforming the public? Yeah, we are. Because of this narrative that we're running with without an explanation that unless a candidate, and I said, and that's again, this is something I try to drive on television, until you tell me a candidate is at 51%, anything could happen in that race. And we spend more time on television talking about the horse race than, quite frankly, we talk about the differences between the two candidates on issues. And I think sort of we got to do a better job of that because frankly, we're never going to solve for completely the era, but we got to do a better job of informing the voters of exactly what the polling means and doing a better job of saying, and David's right, voters really want to know who's going to win. And we got to do a better job of telling them, you know what, sometimes we don't know. And that's
right.
okay.
I want to give Nate the chance to respond because I know he's chomping at the bit, but also I want you to expand on your earlier assessment that the polling industry has not done enough to confront the methodological challenges that have been raised. You're muted, Nate.
I don't have very much to add in terms of the merits of horse race coverage to what David sort of already said, which is that, the entire political system in the United States, our democracy in many ways, runs off of polling. Now, perhaps we can imagine a world where no polls existed, but so long as it does, so long as political decision makers are using polling to decide at the most strategic level what kind of direction the Democratic Party should take, to a tactical level what kind of races we should invest in, then having an accurate horse race number is absolutely essential to those decisions being made in the most accurate way possible. And that's also true for ordinary citizens who need to decide whether they want to give $100 million to Jamie Harrison or to a more competitive candidate. Now, in terms of the industry's problems more generally, I mean, there are a lot of them. And, one thing that's really striking about this call is, and this conference more generally to me, is how many of the things that we're talking about here we could have talked about 4 years ago. Social trust, state polling in the Midwest, white working class voters. I mean, you can go down the list. So I would ask, what's the best publicly available research that we have seen on these things about the magnitude of the problem and the potential ways to address it? I would posit there's very little of it other than an occasional Pew Research study. And those Pew Research studies are very good, but they're not oriented towards the horse race because that's not Pew's principal objective. So one thing to consider is the panel before us, a very good panel on challenges with measuring different groups of non-white voters. We learned, important insights about, whether online polls were a good way to reach older Latino voters, something like that. What's the comparable research that exists on union workers, on the rural Midwest? It's not there. And the polling community has had a lot of time to produce rigorous research on it. Some of that research is being done. David's done some of it. Many partisan firms are doing it internally, and it's not being shared publicly. But it's not there in a way that's publicly digestible that leads to a full and completed scientific process. Even on something as simple as social trust, which David has raised many times over the years, there are partisan pollsters who I talk to that don't think that they can basically replicate David's findings. Now, is that because David's wrong? Is it because he's right and these other polling firms aren't doing a good job? Is it because of geographic considerations and maybe we should be looking at particular areas where this changes? Is it because of the controls being used? Does it vary by mode? And maybe it's true online where David is doing research, but it's not true on the phone. I don't know. But because this isn't being played out in a public way, in a way that leads to, again, a completion of a scientific process, all this stuff is sort of left hanging out there. Pollsters aren't evolving. And the only thing that's happened over the last 4 years that I know of is that there's come to be a consensus on weighting by education, which everyone knew at the time wasn't a sufficient basis for getting the election right.
All right, we need to move into to audience questions, and I want to do these kind of rapid fire, but feel free to tie in some of the loose ends we've left out there. First question comes from Eliza Oppenheim, who's a fourth year in the college, who serves as the IOP's first ever voter engagement chair. And she asks, is there a methodological approach that you think is over or underutilized in polling today? What is it and why? Who wants to take that? Ashley, you're the incoming standards chair.
Yeah, sure, I'll take it. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to respond to David's comment earlier. I don't want the takeaway from this to be that Ashley is like the in defense of telephone polls, but RDD telephone polls reach a segment of the population that aren't reachable over the web. It's just true, right? Like I think that multi-mode is the way to go. I think that's the future. I think we need to be innovative, but I think that to think that that RDD is dead, it just isn't true, right? We struggle with response rates, and we struggle with costs. I grew up in this field, being a caller at, an LSU call lab and doing surveys. And then I ran a call center at the University of Illinois, Springfield. So call centers are doing great work, and doing stuff over the phone and reaching certain segments of the population is incredibly important. Do I think there's a methodology that's overutilized right now? I think it's relying on one single mode and think that you can get all a representative sample. I think that's really where the field is struggling, And so, yeah, and I think, we need more research on how to do multi-mode, and the issues with reaching different populations using different methods is the way to go. But I think, that would be my response.
All right, David.
Yeah, I would say that the most underutilized thing aspect to polling that I think I don't see people talk about is basically around non-response. The polling fundamentally is about this, in statistics we call it this exchangeability assumption that with respect to the thing you're trying to measure, that people who answer your survey are the same as people who don't with respect to what you control for or what you wait on. And I think that in the industry, people talk a lot about trying to find more representative samples. And I think that's, obviously, I do agree with Ashley. There's a lot of multimodal stuff, even just from the perspective of doing web, all of the different panels have different recruiting strategies. And so you need to take that into account in various ways, and SMS to web has also gotten popular, and that also has its own biases. But I think that the biggest thing, and I don't really see people talking about it very much, is that the real way to make this exchangeability assumption true is to control for more things. And that's what I see as like kind of the biggest and underrated challenge in polling, which is that we don't have enough things to control for. One of the reasons I'm really bearish on RDD is that telephone surveys are expensive. There's only so many things that you can ask. There are real cost trade-offs. And since you can't, match people to a voter file, it means that you can't control for administrative data. And if you're not controlling for administrative data, that means that you just are definitely going to be overestimating political participation, probably by double digits. And that's like a very real challenge. And so, yeah, I'd say that's the really underrated thing, is just really thinking hard about trying to control for more things. I think that if we need the solution to polling is finding better statistical controls. And it's not something that I see people talk about very much.
All right, real quick, Nate, Cornell, any under or overutilized? No? Okay.
I got nothing. I think Ashley and Dave are spot on.
Okay. It feels like we're in this weird era where pollsters who were more transparent about their methodological choices, such as the network houses, missed the mark more than some robo pollsters who have murkier reputations for transparency. I won't name any names, but how can traditional media pollsters rebuild public confidence in polling? And should we be requiring pollsters to publish response rates alongside margin of error?
Oh, I guess I'm the closest to being a media person. I like to think we've been pretty transparent over the years as well. And it is true that there are some polling firms out there that are of dubious methodological quality and exhibit essentially none of the traits that we expect out of a good pollster, and yet put out some very good results compared to the actual results. What do you make of that? I mean, look, I think that there are a couple of points I would make. One is that, a lot of pollsters are managing to show better results for Trump by using methods like IVR that don't measure the, young voter population well, and instead, collect the whole 0 to age 49 population as one weight. And then, somehow unsurprisingly, that means it's better for Trump. There are a lot of polls out there that, for reasons that I'll never understand, manage to routinely show Republicans getting 30% of the black vote, and then not surprisingly, they wind up being better for the president in the end. These are essentially cases where two wrongs are making a right. It's in their interest for them to be in that direction because of their partisan lean. But in the end, they're not taking a representative sample of the population, and they're not attempting to control for enough variables that would give them a plausible case for being representative. How can the media improve their credibility? I mean, I think it would probably start by just having more accurate results. I think that the media, I'm not sure the media polls deserve any more credibility than they have. One of the questions that you asked, Dave, was some version of, how do we have a better informed public? And I kind of thought that the public was pretty well informed on the limitations of public polling heading into the cycle because of the 2016 election. I don't think we had to tell them very much to persuade them that the data was about as good as it proved to be. And I don't think that I don't think that there should be a great effort to improve the credibility of it beyond that. I do think that the pollsters themselves can improve credibility by being a little bit more honest about how good their polls were. Not to name names, but last night in the media call, I will name names. Like David Shallon was talking about how the CNN SSRS polls were perfectly fine by him in the national vote, even though their final two polls showed Biden up 12 and 15 points overall, and Biden won by 4. The ABC Washington Post poll, Biden up 17 Wisconsin. They want to say that's 1 in 20 survey non-response random sampling. That's not what it is. And if we can't admit that there are systematic biases here, I don't see why anyone should take it seriously.
Ashley?
Yeah, no, I add on that. So, I used to be chair of the APOR Transparency Initiative, which the whole goal was for pollsters to disclose more about their methodologies so that fellow pollsters, the public, could be critical and be critical consumers of polls. We know the ways in which certain pollsters got it wrong because they're disclosing their methods. With those that aren't disclosing their methods, we don't know if they were able to just adjust some things, or if it was a better sample. We don't know those things, and so I think that's the problem. My argument would be that the more that we can disclose, the more that we can be transparent about our methods, it makes all of us better, because we're able to learn from each other. This is a very collegial community that wants to learn and improve. And so I think disclosing our methods is one way to help our fellow pollsters, in this field. In terms of, disclosing response rate, sure, why not? It's just one measure of error, right? And I just think that we have to go further than that. We have to release data. And so all of that, I think is part of this improving us as a field.
Right. Go ahead.
I'm gonna jump in. So I can agree with all that. Of course, you should be transparent. You should show you all your math, but you're still not going to solve for the problem, because you know what? You're still going to have people undecided. And you're still going to have people who move, right? So so there's always going to be that. There's always going to be that problem. And you know what I spend most of my time doing? I spend most of my time trying to tell my media consultants how to spend money to, in fact, move their horse race. So it's always going to be a moving target. And sometimes that's what we in fact want. Other point I want to make real quick about viability, because I have to go back to this. This idea of the horse race number is how you determine viability. I think that's fundamentally wrong. And as someone who once upon a time worked at the Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee, I tell you right now that if we were judging viability on a horse race number, it would mean people who look like Ashley and I were never viable. So I think, again, we're spending too much time sort of on the importance of a horse race, and we certainly should not take a horse race number and say that a candidate is viable because of that horse race number. There's so many variables that go into sort of making a candidate viable. Hell, Axel Wright and I worked for a candidate. If we just won the horse race, he certainly was not the most viable candidate in that race.
All right, we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to kind of end on a forward-looking question. Maddie Soskin, a second-year MPP candidate at the Harris School of Public Policy, asks, what advice would you give to students interested in polling as a career? And if the perceived legitimacy of polling is truly in decline, will it continue to exist? How will the polling industry look different in 10 years, perhaps? And she adds, P.S., Nate, can you give us a look under the hood of the needle? And is there undue pressure on the needle to succeed? So I'll start with anyone who wants to take it first.
Nate, talk about the needle. Come
on. Under the hood, the needle is at once very simple and it's extremely complicated. The simple part is it compares the results as they come in to our expectations for the results. And then we model the discrepancies between those two things and apply it to the outstanding vote. Despite the fundamental simplicity of the model, it's extremely complicated. It takes a ton of work to collect this data live on election night, to process it, and for it to be robust. We don't get chances to test it and so on. And it's an incredible feat that takes dozens of people to pull off. Is there too much pressure on it? I mean, I don't know. I think this is sort of reminiscent of the problem in probabilistic modeling and polls in general, which is that, unless you're perfect, you're always going to be wrong. I mean, all estimates are biased against the truth, I suppose. And in a high stress environment, people, want to know, they really care about what is going to happen as soon as possible. That's the test that I hold the needle to. Is it ahead of the game? Is it telling you at any given time the best information that there was, even if at any given moment it isn't perfect, and it can't be? I think it largely passes that test. I can think of examples where it hasn't, but I think more often than not, it's ahead of the game. And, unless it's perfect, it can never live up to the expectations of the most discriminating readers, and there's nothing we can really do about that.
All right, so
David, I want to jump in real
Yeah.
quickly because I think this is actually important. It's an important question from your student, and that is, please come into polling. Please come into this because we need more women. We need more diversity. And look, if you want to make a lot of money, learn how to shoot a television ad. But if you want to be able, look, I got into polling because of Du Bois and the idea that you're going to use social science for good. And we need more people in this space who are trying, and look, either you're a Republican, Democrat, I don't even care. This is a space that you can come into and you add your diversity to it because it's so important that we have more diverse thinking and ways of going about this and how to go at certain demographic groups in this space. So please come into polling. It is tough, hard work, and you get criticized a lot, but it is important for the broader good. We need more people and more diversity in this space.
Ashley.
No, he said it perfectly. Find yourself a paid position, get paid, come and work for us. We want you, right? You guys, you bring new experiences, new insights. You have to come and work in this field. It's crucial for us to stay a viable industry.
And where can they look for entry-level opportunities?
Yeah, so you can contact individual organizations. APOR has a listserv that always has research assistant and positions like that. There's lots of student internships. Once again, make sure they're paid. It's important to get paid for your work, and you just contact me. We're happy. We're happy to help you. So
intern. I was an intern for Stan Greenberg once upon a time. This is the only reason I'm here. Internships are important.
You're about to be flooded with resumes. Okay, David, I'm going to give you the last word on this question, this part of Maddie's question. That's how could or should the polling industry look different 5-10 years from now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the big thing for me is I think that the current business model and production model of how the polling industry works can't really rise to the challenges of how things exist now. And so I think the future of polling is organizations like YouGov that rely really heavily on pretty sophisticated modeling to a point where transparency is impossible. I didn't get to answer the transparency question, but I think that polling's at a point now where in order to do a good job, you have to tie to voter files, you have to build a series of sophisticated models, whether they're turnout models or partisanship models, or whether it's like bringing in external data, the existence of which might not even be public, and like whether or not you get the right result really hinges on like a big series of technical questions. Like I'm sure YouGov's polling apparatus is really backed by probably literally hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And so I think that that's kind of the direction the polling industry is moving in, away from producing polls and more toward building analytics products and modeling products on top of surveys and to answer questions. And I've seen that, within the polling space, there's within the progressive movement, like Civis and Swable and other groups have done a lot to move in that direction. And I think, if you look in the brand space as opposed to public polls, that's also the direction that things have moved into. So I think, the field is going to get, more technical, more like engineering, more like machine learning engineering, and a little less like traditional social science, though it's still social science and it's still very hard and it's still very important.
Well, thank you for painting the picture of the future that we'll all be living in. It is 1:34, and so as much as I'd love to continue this for another few hours, that can only mean one thing, and that's that I've seen enough. In closing, I want to thank the entire staff of the UChicago IOP. Well, first of all, I want to thank the four of you, Ashley, Nate, Cornell, David, terrific observations. I also want to thank the entire staff of the UChicago IOP, including especially Christine Hurley for her heroic work pulling this together, Gretchen Crosby-Sims, Allison Siegel, Coronado, Emily Stanitz, and some guy who named David Axelrod, whose idea this was. I also want to thank Allie Flynn, our web editor at the Cook Political Report. It's really been an honor and privilege to work with all of them on conceptualizing this. I also know that there are some of you out there in the crowd who are new to the Cook Political Report and might be curious about what we have to offer. And in the coming year, we'll be providing subscribers with access to exclusive briefings and conferences similar to this, detailed state-by-state analysis of the all-important redistricting process and who's running in the 2022 midterms, an election that George Will recently described as the most crucial non-presidential election year in US history. No election's ever been called that before, I'm sure. So please keep an eye out for an email. We'll be sending each of you with an exclusive offer for 2 weeks free access to the Cook Political Report, or you can go to cookpolitical.com right now and sign up using access code margin of error for that, that free 2 weeks. We hope this was an illuminating conference for you. It certainly was for me and for us. And now I'm going to throw it back to Mr. Class of 1976, David Axelrod, for some final words.
Thanks for dating me, Dave. I just want to say a big thanks to you, to Charlie Cook, to Amy Walter, to Jessica Taylor, and all our friends at Cook for partnering with us on this. I don't know that we solved the problems facing polling, but I think we aired them, and we had a great conversations about them from many different standpoints. A lot was learned from these conversations, and thank you so much for your work in helping conceptualize these sessions as we were planning. You know, Cornell mentioned internships. I just want to say again to those who are still listening, if you want really magnificent summer interns and you want to help launch careers in your particular areas, whether it's polling or else other areas, please contact the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. We pay for the interns, you get the benefit of them, and you will help launch careers of future panelists in discussions like this. Thank you so much for participating. We look forward to more such events in the future, and for a better and improved quality of research as well, perhaps because of some of the ideas that were surfaced.